Well, why don't we go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to Preservation Virginia's Legislative Preview. I'm Elizabeth Kostelny and it's my honor to serve as the CEO for the organization. I know I speak on behalf of our staff and our board in saying that we hope that you and your families are well and safe. I want to recognize that we're joined by Senator Hashmi, and Delegate Carr will be joining us in just a few minutes. Both of them will be sharing their perspective later in our program, so welcome. And I also want to thank our panelists who are participating in this afternoon's session. We have some great leaders who will share their perspective on this session that's coming up. Like every other event and meeting during this unprecedented time, our annual convening is taking a different form. So now that we're in a virtual session, you are probably familiar with the routine. We are collecting your questions. You can register those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep a list and we'll respond to as many as time allows at the end of this program. The 2021 General Assembly session promises to be like none other. As we speak, both houses are still determining exactly how long the session will last and how they will meet. Right now, approaches differ between the House and the Senate, and as we understand, negotiations are ongoing. So stay tuned. When our alerts go out, we'll let you know the latest. We're living in a remarkable time. History and historic places are front and center in our lives. That seems to be an understatement, having watched what happened at the U.S. Capitol last night, looking back at the last spring's protest calling for racial and social justice, and living through a global pandemic and the resulting and widening economic strife. All of these events bring levels of uncertainty and present challenges. Public policy is responding, whether it's acknowledging and funding historic African American cemeteries and other sites of underrepresented history that have been ignored and overlooked for far too long, maintaining the strength and effectiveness of the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program and increasing access to it, and ensuring that alternatives are considered that avoid and minimize impacts to historic resources. All of these efforts are playing an important role in preserving the vitality of historic structures, communities, downtowns, and cultural landscapes. Today we have a great panel of experts to preview the 2021 General Assembly session. To help manage our time, I'm going to briefly recognize our first four speakers. Genevieve Keller is the chair of Preservation Virginia's Board of Trustees and will bring greetings from those trustees. Julie Langan, director of the Department of Historic Resources, will share the department's perspective on this session. Following Julie, Trip Pollard, vice chair of Preservation Virginia and chair of our public policy, as well as an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center, and Hunter Jamerson with Macaulay Jamerson, who represents Preservation Virginia at the General Assembly, will share a review of last year's session and a preview of the upcoming weeks. Afterwards, they will introduce our special speakers. So, Jenny, I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of our Board of Trustees of Preservation Virginia, I'm pleased to see several of our members on the webinar today, participating both as presenters and attendees, and a special welcome to Renee Ingram and EJ Scott, who are just joining our board this month. And a huge thank you to the legislators and to everyone else for your time today to prepare for the upcoming session. We've probably all shared some late night media this week, and time is very valuable. Public policy in preservation is one of our most important activities at Preservation Virginia, and we know that it takes all of us working together in state and local government, as well as preservation organizations and historic sites, to make sure that we have the right tools to identify and reevaluate our historic resources and ensure that they're recognized and used equitably and strategically for public education, adaptive uses, economic development, and for tourism. Our most important governmental partner is the Department of Historic Resources, and so I'm very pleased this afternoon to introduce its director, Julie Langan, who also serves as Virginia State Historic Preservation Officer. In those capacities, Julie oversees state and federal preservation programs in one of the busiest and most important state preservation offices in our nation. Julie.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of today's briefing, and I have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to jump right in by leading off with a summary of what was funded during the 2020 regular session and the subsequent changes that have occurred. The 2020 regular session was very good to the Department of Historic Resources, as there were a number of items included in the budget that related to the Northam administration's commitment to historic and racial justice that also aligned with DHR's own budget requests. Not everything that we requested was funded, but the total of new DHR funding was the largest increase in general fund appropriation in the history of the agency. So you can only imagine our excitement when that budget bill was signed. Those items that were funded included additional space for our archaeological collections, multiple IT projects, and as you can only imagine, our information technology expenses just continue to increase. We also received additional funding for our historic highway marker program so that we could add more markers to the system that dealt with underrepresented topics. It included a position to deal with historic cemeteries. It included the historical African American cemeteries and grave fund. And then finally, there was funding for the development of a virtual heritage trail that would run from DC to Fort Monroe. Shortly after this budget was approved, COVID became a reality, and it was necessary for the Commonwealth to reprioritize its spending. And what that meant is that some of these new appropriations were unallotted. And what that meant was that they continued to show up as line items in the budget, but they were unfunded. The funding was taken away. So of those items that were newly funded that I just ran through, all that remained after this process of unallotment was the funding for the additional collection space, partial funding for our IT needs, and the funding for the African American Cemetery Fund. Then, during the special session, the state budget was such that about 50% of all of the unallotted items in the budget were restored. Not 50% of DHR's, but statewide, 50% were restored. And for DHR, that resulted in renewed funding for the highway marker program. The virtual heritage trail received its funding back. And then there were 10 new pass-through grants to nonprofits that had never been part of the budget that came out of the regular session. That was new funding that came out of the budget bill resulting from the special session. So that all gets confusing, but I think it's important to have that framework as I now move forward to talk about the upcoming session. And I'd like to begin first with Governor Northam's budget and legislative priorities as they relate to historic preservation. Because most of the bills have yet to be filed, I don't have a lot of detail or bill numbers on all of these things. So I encourage you to check with Preservation Virginia's forthcoming legislative alerts for bill numbers and detail. As was announced in early December, Governor Northam's historic justice initiatives total nearly $25 million for projects to transform historical sites and advance historic justice initiatives. And these include restoration of the funding for the cemetery position that we lost. And now that we have another chance at it, let me explain a little bit what we're hoping that position would do. It would be to hire an archaeologist who has expertise in historic cemeteries and human remains. This person would provide assistance to a broad range of stakeholders who request assistance virtually on a daily basis regarding the treatment of historic human remains and the care and stewardship of historic cemeteries. This person would also manage DHR's burial permit program for the archaeological removal of human remains. And the number of applications for that permit program have been dramatically increasing over the past 5 years. And then this person would also administer the grant programs for cemetery preservation, both the Revolutionary War Grave Fund as well as the African American cemetery grants. Hopefully this person would also have time to go out and further identify and record both marked and unmarked African American cemeteries. The governor's budget also includes funding for the development of a slavery heritage site and improvements to the slave trail in Richmond's Shockoe Bottom. It includes a re-envisioning of Monument Avenue. There is support for the Virginia Emancipation and Freedom Monument proposed for Browns Island. There is funding to repatriate tombstones from the former Columbian Harmony Cemetery, which was in DC, and those headstones were removed and brought to Virginia, and DHR has been involved in making a plan for how to appropriately retrieve and recognize the importance of those headstones. And then finally, there's funding for a new statue to represent Virginia in the United States Capitol. And you may be aware that the statue of Robert E. Lee was recently removed and that the commission charged with its replacement has selected Barbara Rose Johns. Next, I'd like to move on to the Secretary's initiatives. Secretary Matt Strickler has put forward HB 1836, which will bring about a name change of the Secretariat. It is proposed that the Secretariat, instead of being known as the Secretariat of Natural Resources, will be changed to the Secretariat of Natural and Cultural Resources. This proposed name change recognizes that historic preservation is a priority and the fact that environmental justice values impact all of the Secretariat's agencies. This name change has been a personal priority for me, and I'm really grateful to Secretary Strickler for initiating this bill. Also included in it is a designation of the Secretary as the Commonwealth's Chief Resilience Officer. Another Secretary bill is the codification of Conserve Virginia. And I don't have a bill number yet for this. For those of you unfamiliar with Conserve Virginia, it's a tool developed to strategically guide investments in land conservation. It provides a map of Virginia's highest conservation value lands based on 19 data inputs. And included in those 19 inputs are historic resources and scenic resources. Currently, there are 6 million acres that have been entered into the system as priority for conservation, and that data is regularly reassessed and updated. And in fact, we're going through that updating process right now. The patron for this bill is Senator Monty Mason, and I'm sure very soon we will be able to share a bill number. Last but not least, DHR has a single agency bill of its own, and it concerns our easement program. The patron is Delegate Aird, and again, no bill number. This is a very minor change, but I think one with significant impact. Currently, a property must be listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register or be identified as battlefield by studies conducted by the National Park Service in order to qualify for our easement program and in order for the Board of Historic Resources to hold an easement. Our bill would authorize the Board of Historic Resources to hold easements on properties that are not listed but have been determined eligible for listing. So it doesn't necessarily expand the number of worthy properties, but what it does is remove the obstacle to participation in the program. And we're seeking this change because the complexity as well as the potential expense of listing a property on the register is often a financial obstacle for potential easement donors, including private property owners, nonprofits, and advocacy groups. So from our perspective, this is an equity issue, and we want to remove that financial impediment. I'll conclude by mentioning just a couple of other items very quickly. There will be a joint resolution, HJ 0525, which recommends that Barbara Rose Johns be the person to replace Lee at the U.S. Capitol. I also expect Senator McClelland to submit a budget request for additional funding to DHR so that we can identify and record additional African and Native American historic properties. There are also efforts afoot to pursue additional penalties for relic hunting on properties protected by easements. I don't have a patron yet for that. That's being sponsored by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Later in the program, you'll be hearing from Delegate Carr and Senator Hashmi about some of their initiatives. So I am just going to conclude at this point. I know there's time later in the agenda for questions, so I'll turn it over now to Tripp and to Hunter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. As Julie just mentioned, we are going to have questions a little later on. So if you do have questions, just a quick housekeeping note, be sure to put them in the Q&A tab at your screen. And then we will try to get to those following this panel and the one right after that. So welcome everyone. Again, my name is Tripp Pollard. And as Jenny Keller noted in kicking off this event, public policy is a central component of what Preservation Virginia does. And a central component of our policy work is focused on the General Assembly, whose activities have a major impact on historic preservation. We work with our partners, with all of you who are joining today, and a network of preservationists to address priority preservation issues. So Will, if you could start the slides. If not, I can just keep going. There you go. And next slide, if you would. So as was mentioned Julie, and this is also true for Preservation Virginia overall, the 2020 session was an extremely successful session for historic preservation. And so next slide. Now, one of the main things that Preservation Virginia worked on last session was a bill that did pass that requires the State Corporation Commission, SEC, before approving construction of any electric transmission line to determine that it will avoid or reasonably minimize adverse impacts, and among other things, to historic resources. And this grew in part out of the experience, assuming most of you are familiar with the transmission lines over the James River, as well as some other issues and other parts of the Commonwealth involving transmission lines impact on scenic areas, as well as historic areas and sensitive natural resources. Preservation Virginia helped draft this bill, worked closely with the lead patron, and we're pleased to say that, that it did successfully pass. Next slide, if you would. There was a number of other bills that we worked on last session, but two other major areas were strengthening and expanding provisions and funding for historical African American cemeteries and graves. There were a number of bills on this last session that were successful, and this builds upon efforts of both DHR and Preservation Virginia in recent years to greatly increase the support and recognition of the importance of these typically far too long ignored resources. The other area where we worked, which is another one that Julie Langan mentioned, is for increasing resources for the Department of Historic Resources. And she mentioned several of those specific ones that it was an extremely successful budget year during the regular session of the 2020 legislature, but then the pandemic hit. I'll turn it over to Hunter to pick up the story from there.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. My name is Hunter Jamerson. For those who don't know me personally, I'm an attorney practicing at the law firm Macaulay and Jamerson here in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm the registered lobbyist, have been for several years for Preservation Virginia. Work closely with Tripp, Jenny and your policy committee, and Elizabeth and Will and the PBA leadership on priorities at the General Assembly. And as Tripp mentioned, we've got our legislative priorities, but each year we also have priorities within the budget bill, a live recurring document in Virginia, which gives not only funding to state agencies, but also direction to state agencies for operation of their purview in the state's executive branch. So as Tripp mentioned, the pandemic dramatically changed the trajectory of the Virginia budget, and many of the successes in the regular session became significantly encumbered and under pressure during the legislative veto session, which took place after really COVID-19 had begun to become prevalent in Virginia and have a dramatic impact on state finances. As a result, the governor took an interesting approach in his April veto session budget bill, in which he unallotted much of the funding for priorities that had been laid out in the state budget during the regular session. And unallotment is not a reflection of a change in policy position. It's simply a change in the withholding of the distribution of those funds, recognizing that they may not materialize or they may be necessary for redirection during the public health emergency. And so some affected budget items are listed here on the left side of this slide, primarily set forth in budget item 386.10. And this is within Julie Langan's Department of Historic Resources. And I won't be redundant to items Julie mentioned, but several of the priority items that we were very pleased had received funding were then unallotted in the April veto session. You see those itemized on the left side. Those include important provisions such as funding for the African American History and Cultural Center at Virginia Union, funding for the Historical Highway Marker Program, the African American History Trail, as well as other funding for positions within DHR, Cemetery Preservationist position, Underwater Archaeology Program. We'll hear more about how we're approaching those key positions from our legislative guests and others after the next session. During the special budget session that reconvened in August to address what we then knew about COVID-19's impacts by then, including on the state funding provisions and our state revenues, we shift to the right side of this slide. And during the special session, the governor took action to more than unallot the funds for some of these programs, but to suspend them entirely. And the budget item 386.10 itemizes many of these same items on the left column in the DHR budget, and then 375.10, many of these same items in the DCR budget dealing with state park operations and funding and preserved land areas. So, we see the iteration from pre-COVID was quite a rosy picture, quite a lot of legislative success. At the infancy of COVID's outbreak in Virginia, a unallotment but retention of these budget priorities, and during the special session, recognition that these were no longer priorities of the state for investment as a result of COVID-19. We now enter the forthcoming session. I'll turn it back over to Tripp to talk about where we're going to try to direct the state as we move into the 2021 session and reassessing these priorities and redirecting funds based on new revenue forecasts.
Great. So there are going to be, as we look ahead to the next session, a number of items that Preservation Virginia will be involved with in the coming session. As Julie Langan mentioned, there are a number of budget and amendments coming from the administration and DHR that we'll be considering in the coming session. Among others, and again, she outlined these that won't go into any detail, is the governor's proposed $25 million historic justice initiatives. That does include funding for a number of resources. And I'll also just point out one in particular that we were happy to see is the funding proposed for DHR to hire a historic preservation professional to administer projects involving historic cemeteries. This is something that Preservation Virginia has pushed for a number of years. Glad to see it on the governor's recommendations, and that is certainly something we'll be working to be sure gets passed this session. Also, the preservation easement legislation that was mentioned that would expand the definition of easements that can be held, and changing of the name of the Secretary of Natural Resources to include cultural resources, which is another long overdue change that we will be supporting. Next slide, please. In addition to the governor's and DHR package, there are going to be a number of other bills and budget items that we've heard or seen. Two of those are ones that we will be hearing about more on our next panel. And first, there is going to be an additional budget proposal involving underwater archaeology, and then a bill to prevent historic sites from being harmed by siting of landfills. Next slide. In addition to those, which again we'll hear more about in a moment, there is going to be a bill to prioritize the conservation purposes in the interpretation of easements. This is intended to at least partially address a recent, fairly bad decision from the Virginia Supreme Court. And next slide. And then finally, in addition, Preservation Virginia will remain vigilant to protect the historic rehabilitation tax credit against any attempt to weaken or eliminate this absolutely critical tool. We saw efforts to do just that a number of years in a row. We and our partners pushed back very strongly, managed to defeat most if not all of those, except for one minor exception, and have educated decision makers quite a bit to the point where last session, for the first time in a number of years, we did not face a serious threat, but we will be remaining on guard for the upcoming session. So now I'll turn it back to Hunter for the particular process.
Great. So January 13th is the most certain thing I can tell you about this slide, which is that the legislative session will begin on January 13th. Most aspects of how session will function are not clear until there is a scheduling resolution in both chambers. On the 13th, we won't have certainty about how the session will work. We are certainly hearing that on the House side, this is likely to be an entirely virtual session. Hearing that on the Senate side, this is more likely, perhaps at the moment, to mirror the special session with primarily in-session or in-person floor sessions at the Science Museum here in Richmond, committee action, whether in person or virtually, or a mix of the two. So that remains to be seen, and we won't know for sure until this gets started on the 13th. It also remains to be seen how long session will take and how much can be accomplished during that period. There were calls from the Republican caucus to maintain the constitutional 30-day session, withhold support for an extension to more customary 45 days in this odd year. There have been reciprocal calls from the Democratic caucus to take whatever steps necessary to legislate as long as necessary and up to and including a special session. More recently, we're hearing that we seem to be realigning back towards the norm, and that perhaps we will see 45 days in both chambers, but it remains to be seen, and until January 13th, the chambers will not have set their schedules. Also remains to be seen whether the budget can be successfully negotiated within this regular session period, or whether a special session would be necessitated. I think some of that will depend upon how COVID continues to impact Virginia, how confident we are in the forecast, budget forecasts we're receiving, which are of course in part tied to those COVID impacts, as well as just the logistics of trying to negotiate the state's budget remotely. As you can imagine, it's a meaty document, it's a healthy amount of money, and it's a very difficult thing for people who are not together to accomplish, or even with their staff to accomplish. So we will see some of those challenges worked out over the course of the next week, and as we get the scheduling order. Public involvement is of course a challenge when the General Assembly is not meeting in person and in its usual course, but we did have experience from the special session, and in terms of public involvement through digital public comment and through your PVA action alerts, we will update you how to sign up to speak to bills and how to contact your legislator on bills of key importance. You will receive an action alert as there are bills that PVA needs you to take particular action on. That'll come direct by email. And Will, I think if you go to our last slide, you can best ensure that you stay involved by signing up for PVA's alerts generally. You can do that through the Preservation Virginia website. We try to get these alerts and web updates out each Monday, updating you on the actions of the last week. It's important to let Preservation Virginia know if you follow through on our action alert and reach out to your legislator so that we can have the feedback of what you heard from your legislator. That often is some of the best impacts that we have, are PVA members speaking to their legislator and getting their legislator's feedback and filtering it back to us. So remember to loop us in as you choose to engage. You'll get a session wrap-up communication summarizing everything that happens in the 2021 session, and then we'll also do a summary of the actions that occur at the governor's veto session. So I think our next segment, Tripp, if you'd like to introduce our speakers and discuss our legislative reception. And Tripp, you're on mute.
One quick thing before that is, it is, as Hunter said, going to be a very interesting session. And Preservation Virginia will be having our legislative reception again this year, but it will be online January 28th at 7 p.m. I hope all of you can join us. It is no cost to attend, but we are seeking sponsors. So let me put in a quick plug for that. And next slide. So as mentioned, get involved, check our website to sign up for alerts and follow updates, and do hope you can attend and consider sponsoring our virtual legislative reception and engage with your legislators. So thank you for your support of Preservation Virginia's policy work, including the upcoming session. And now I'd like to kick off our next panel, speaking of contacting legislators. We're going to start off with two General Assembly members, as well as the Executive Vice President and CEO of AIA Virginia. First, it is my pleasure to introduce Senator Ghazala Hashmi. Senator Hashmi represents the 10th District in the Virginia State Senate. It includes parts of the city of Richmond, parts of Chesterfield County, and all of Powhatan County. She's an experienced educator and advocate who spent nearly 30 years working with Virginia's college and university system before shifting to politics. Elected in 2019, she has quickly established herself as a strong voice on many issues, including historic preservation, education, equity, healthcare access, and the environment. Senator Hashmi, thank you very much for joining us. And I'll be introducing other panel members as we go. So turn the floor over to you, Senator.
Good morning, and thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to everyone who's joining this call this afternoon. I especially appreciate all the wonderful work that Historic Virginia has been doing, Preservation Virginia is doing to safeguard our critical historic sites, and to promote the value of education throughout our community on what these important sites mean for us and how they share and tell the story of Virginia. So thank you very much for all this good work. I'll just briefly outline one of my bills that is connected to the work of Preservation Virginia and the issues that concern you. Just to kind of look at the genesis of this particular piece of legislation is it impacts my district. So I represent the 10th Senatorial District, which covers a good part of Chesterfield County, a good part of the city of Richmond, and all of Powhatan. And so when I had first begun running for office, folks who were deeply concerned about a proposed mega landfill that is scheduled to be sited on the border between Powhatan County and Cumberland County had reached out and shared their concerns around the environmental impact and the degradation of our soil and water and air quality in that area. But concurrent with that, I learned quickly that there was another significant concern that was resulting from this particular landfill citation, and that was the impact on a Rosenwald school in Cumberland County. It is the Pine Grove School that served for many generations of African-American families to educate and to give opportunities to the people in the community in Pine Grove. And this school was sited, or is located, near where the landfill was to be sited, and would be impacted not just in terms of the quality of the surroundings, but also access to it. So visitors and other folks who are interested in visiting the school, learning about its history and all that it offered to the community, they would not be able to access it and have that availability. So it is a concern for our history. And so working with the folks who are seeking to preserve the school, the AMMD project, we began to bring together the work of the environmental groups as well as the historic preservation community to put together a bill that seeks to address this concern. So the legislation that we are proposing for this particular 21 cycle it's adding an 8th area of consideration for the state. So when the state is going through a landfill siting review process, in addition to thinking about things such as floodplains or impact on wetlands or public and private water supply systems, we are adding an 8th area of consideration before the permit is offered. And that is that if there is a historic building or a structure object located within 3 miles of a landfill that has been proposed, that has to be part of the consideration in the permitting process. And we want our agencies to be conscious of that. Any kind of impact as severe as a mega landfill needs to take into consideration the impact that it's going to have on not just the community, not just the environment, but any potential damage that it could do to a historic location, a historic structure or object that we want to preserve. And so we're asking the legislature to take this into consideration. This is a bill that we will be bringing forth in next session, which is right around the corner, as you know, and we hope to have good support for this particular piece of legislation. So I'll just stop there, and we might have some Q&A afterwards, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Senator. That school in this issue is one that President Virginia has been very deeply involved with. We named that Pine Grove region as on our most endangered sites list most recently. And now I'm pleased to introduce Delegate Betsy Carr, who represents portions of the city of Richmond in the Virginia House of Delegates. In addition to serving as a delegate, she served for 16 years as outreach director at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in downtown Richmond. She has a lengthy wealth of other experiences, including serving on the Richmond School Board, working for the supervisor of statewide programs at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, at University of Richmond's Women's Resource Center, and at the Virginia Historical Society. Delegate Carr has been a member of the House since 2009 and is focused on improving education, healthcare, preserving our environment, and someone I've worked with for many years on many bills. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Tripp, for that introduction. Thank you to all the folks who are listening in on this and watching and continuing your support for our preservation that's so important in the Commonwealth. I'm very excited to be resubmitting a budget amendment that actually was passed in that great budget 2020, but then was unallotted when we with the COVID because it was an ongoing expense, one of the reasons. But what it is the funding a position for underwater archaeology. And let me tell you why this is important. Virginia is one of the only coastal states that doesn't have a position such as this. It is mandated in the code that Virginia inventory and manage its underwater resources, its submerged resources. So this is a really important step that we need to take to reinstitute this position. Example of something, if we don't have an underwater archaeologist, the damage that can be done, for instance, when we had the, it can be illustrated when the James Fort in the James River was dug up, not by the way it's supposed to be done, but by metal detectors, and so it was destroying proportions of that significant resource rather than inventorying it and managing it. So I'm very excited about this. Interesting, I was talking with Catherine Rowe, who is president of William and Mary, and you know they're connected with Virginia Institute, Virginia Marine Institute, and they she's informed me that actually marine archaeology was actually founded, or the kind of the study of it, or the, what you want to say, the the classification was invented by, or started or created by, two African American scientists at the beginning of the last century. So, William and Mary is moving forward to try to replace, put in position folks that have been kind of underserved or underrepresented in these positions. So that's another thing to tie onto this. We also have, I know when we were talking about this, you know, who knows what slave ships might be under the water and so forth. This is just a really important measure that we can move forward, and very excited. Hopefully we can move forward in a positive way with this during the session.
Thank you so much, Delegate Carr. Next up, we have another person I greatly respect, Corey Clayborne. Corey's an architect who's been deeply involved with the American Institute of Architects at the local, state, and national level. Prior to his appointment as Executive Vice President and CEO of AIA Virginia, he was project manager and senior architect for Wiley Wilson, where his responsibilities included financial health, quality control, operational management, and project management for a variety of projects. Corey's been involved with extensive community service, including mentoring programs, serving on the Charlottesville Planning Commission, and he is currently a member of the Preservation Virginia Board of Directors. Corey, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tripp, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to Delegate Carr and Senator Hashmi. It's so great to see both of you. You have both been exceptional friends and supporters of those who shaped the built environment. I'll be really brief just to make sure we leave time for Q&A, as I'm sure some are filtering in as we speak now. But as Tripp mentioned, I work with the American Institute of Architects, which in summation is the voice of the architecture profession, of which preservation is certainly a very important element of that voice. I think you saw in Tripp's and Hunter's presentation just moments ago that one word used to describe the 2021 session that's coming up is probably unorthodox, right? It's just so many moving pieces. And so as such, we will not be personally submitting any bills. However, that doesn't mean we won't be doing anything. We're going to use this time as a way to really strengthen our relationships between our members, our architects and designers, and their respective legislators around the state in an organized grassroots fashion. At the end of the day, what we want is for each of our elected leaders, when they hear the term architecture or preservation, they're able to put a face, right, to that terminology. And ultimately, we can be a resource to help them do their jobs better. And so, as I mentioned, the statewide event will be launching. It'll go for about a month in the spring, likely virtual due to COVID. We don't see that fully subsiding by the spring quite yet. But with these meetings, we'll be matching up, again, our designers and architects to meet with these individuals and talk about issues that impact our communities, right? So it could be environmental justice. It could be designing safe schools and preserving these respective buildings that they're housed in. It could be sustainability, which preservation plays a large part in that. But ultimately, these meetings won't have any ask. It's essentially relationship building and offering ourselves up as a resource. For us, I think the highest compliment is that if any legislator has a bill and they pick up the phone and call us or Preservation Virginia saying, we need your input, that's one of the highest compliments we could ever get. We just started some of these meetings. Actually, yesterday we had a meeting with Senator Hashmi. And so we've been together twice in 2 days now. And I thought that discussion went really well. We had industry leaders talk about, again, environmental issues, infrastructure issues, building issues, and so forth. And it was such an honor to do that. We look to have more of those around the state. But to bring this all to summation, again, we won't be running any bills this year, but using this as an intentional time to build a foundation with our elected leaders around the state so that when they do need something, they have a face that they can call. So thanks, Tripp.
Great. Thank you so much, Corey. And thanks again, Senator Hashmi and Delegate Carr. And now I'll turn things over to Elizabeth Kostelny, who is going to run our question and answer session here.
Thank you, Tripp, and thank you to all our panelists. We have a few questions that have come in, and Senator Hashmi, there's sort of a couple for you. One was wanting to understand whether these new considerations will, for landfills, will be part of the state DEQ permitting. Is that the plan? I think you're still on mute.
Yes, it's in the part of the code that is dedicated to the landfill siting review process. And it's the siting review process then ultimately feeds into the DEQ permitting process.
Okay. And sort of related to that, there was a question wondering if there was any consideration of the language being broadened to include more than just a building, but structures and the archaeology associated with.
So I'll read the language that we have included, and we had shared it with Tripp earlier to get his thoughts on this. But if we need to make any edits or amendments, we certainly have time to do that. As it reads right now, the eighth element for the review process will be within 3 miles of any historic district, building, structure, object, or site designated. That's pursuant to Article 1 of Chapter 22, et cetera, et cetera. But if the word site designated is not sufficient and you would recommend that we be more specific, certainly please let us know.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There was another question, and Tripp or Hunter, maybe you can speak to that. The bill that proposes sort of refining the definition of the conservation purposes for the conservation easement. Are there any risks there, and why is that legislation needed?
The reason it's being introduced, and again, clarify, this is not a Preservation Virginia bill. This is a bill that a number of organizations that hold conservation easements, land trusts in particular, have drafted, and I have not seen the latest version of the bill, so I can't answer completely, but I can tell you that it stems from a recent decision of the Virginia Supreme Court. It was a very narrow interpretation, many in the conservation community believe, of the easement against the holder of the easement and against the conservation purposes for which the easement was originally granted. There was legislation that was a little more comprehensive to address this, is my understanding. It's more comprehensive. Again, I haven't seen the final version this year. Last session, it came very, very close to passing. It did not ultimately pass, and so this is an attempt, again, to address this Virginia Supreme Court ruling to place a greater emphasis on effectuating the conservation purposes of an easement when there are questions of interpretation.
Thank you. Julie, I think this question is probably for you. There was a question about, with the new cemetery experts position at DHR, will there be an opportunity for them to consult with owners of, or with private, with cemeteries on private lands, or will this be focused most totally on the African American Cemeteries Fund?
No, this is going to be a position that deals with the full universe of historic cemeteries. So it's not limited to African American cemeteries, but as I said, this person will be administering the African American Cemetery Fund. We also hope that they will help identify additional African American cemeteries, especially those that are unmarked, because there are thousands of them and we do not have a good handle on where they're located, and they are not showing up in VCRIS, which is a huge problem. But we will use this person to respond to all types of inquiry concerning all types of cemeteries.
Okay, thank you. And maybe just a general question to Senator Hashmi and Delegate Carr. In this strange world of COVID and a General Assembly that's operating in a very unusual way, what's the most effective way for individuals to advocate for positions? We know we probably fill up your email boxes and your phone logs, but how can we be effective in this environment? You're both on mute still.
I was going to let the delegate answer first. Delegate? You're still on mute.
There she
There you go.
You went back on mute.
Thank you so much. You know, I think the thing is it's going to be helpful to have emails. And again, we always appreciate in our office, you know, there are a lot of emails that say the same thing. If you can just individualize it a little bit so that we know that somebody just hadn't lifted up something, but they have a personal interest in it and can put that little personal touch in it, that's great. Emails are great though, you know, we can do that. But if anybody has anything urgent, what we're doing is telling folks to text or call me and my my chief of staff to get, you know, if there's something coming up and you're concerned that their bill's going to be heard this afternoon and you want to make sure that there's a certain point about it, just let us know about that. The thing is that we're going to have, you know, we're not going to have administrative aides like we had before and people sitting out front and answering all the telephone calls. What the calls are going to do is go to like a call center. So if you call in, we'll get the call information, but it won't be until the end of the day. So that's what we say about that. But, you know, we're kind of going to go on like we always have been. You know, Olivia's always setting up my meetings, and we always want to be available. And we haven't noticed any difference in the way that things are going forward than as we usually do. And before we move on, I just want to give a shout out to Julie Langan, because we are so privileged and lucky to have her in Virginia doing what she's doing, really performing this very important function. And I just want to say that because I'm sure everybody knows it, but we need to keep on saying it because we need to keep her there. Just doing that great work. And she's just such a wonderful resource and benefit for the citizens in our Commonwealth and the concerns that we have in conservation and preservation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And so in terms of getting in touch with my office, just as Delegate Carr has shared, we really haven't noticed a big difference. A lot of folks have been emailing us, and that's simply, for me, it's district10@senate.virginia.gov. And that probably is the best way to get a quick response. I have a wonderful legislative aide who monitors it all throughout the day and responds very quickly and efficiently. And the other item that we have launched for session now is a appointment scheduler, and that's going to be, it's being shared through a variety of media. We'll also put it on our social media on our webpage. But if you email and request an appointment, you will receive the scheduling app, and you can just sign up for any time. That's good. My committee meetings and other prescribed meetings for session will be listed, but if I can't meet with you, then either my chief of staff or LA will be able to meet with you, and you can sign up at a time that's convenient. We actually welcome that. We've been doing tons of Zoom calls, and so we can easily schedule, the app will actually schedule the Zoom call automatically for you, and you'll get the link for the Zoom and be able to join into the session then.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking at the time. I know we have one other question about guidelines for cemeteries, but we'll try to get to that offline. And to be conscious of everybody's time, I want to thank our panelists for participating today. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. Do keep in mind we're going to have our legislative reception virtually this year on January 28th. And as Tripp mentioned, we are looking for sponsors. Those sponsors help support our activities, our lobbying, our lobbyist contract, and other activities during the General Assembly session. So we need your support, and stay tuned to the alerts. We'll be getting those out very soon. And thank you again, and everybody stay well and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.